it's quite interesting. He can be dismissed from the Liberal Party and put out of the Liberal Party, as can anybody by the party. But a Prime Minister can't put any Member of Parliament out and basically sack a Member of Parliament. That's up to that Member of Parliament to make a decision to resign themselves.
Sure, but were we not dealing with a question of a slender majority, would it not be a different outcome for Andrew Laming? I mean, is it possible to read this any other way?
Well, I don't know. I mean, ultimately it is up to Andrew Laming to make the decision as to whether he stays or resigns. Nobody else can force him to do that. I suspect it's been very strongly encouraged, and it's certainly been made very clear by a number of Liberal MPs and ministers about their perspective on his behaviour, and it's very clear that nobody believes that his behaviour is in any way acceptable, justifiable,
right,
and tolerable.
But the instant reactions that we had from the state leaders and the federal leaders when it came to the allegations for these different MPs were very different. And I want to talk about the idea of this slender majority now. Let's reflect for a moment on the current makeup of both the New South Wales and federal governments and how they're impacted by the potential loss of a sitting member. 35 Liberals and 11 Nationals currently populate the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, giving the government a total of 46 seats. Labor holds 36, with another 11 sitting on the crossbench. Now, this now includes Michael Johnson, who moved after the rape allegations surfaced last week. If he goes, the New South Wales government effectively loses its working majority. At the federal level, the Liberal Party holds 60 seats in the House of Reps and the Nationals 16. Labor holds 68 seats, with 7 sitting on the crossbench, among them former Liberal Craig Kelly, who has guaranteed supply. Now, with Craig Kelly's vote, the government has a slim majority of 1. Are we seeing here, Jamila, the New South Wales government taking risks that their federal counterparts are not willing to?
Absolutely, we are. And look, if you'd asked me a week ago whether or not it would be the New South Wales Deputy Premier, John Barilaro, being the barometer of leadership when it comes to addressing the terrible treatment of women, both within parliaments and by people who serve in them, like, I would not have believed you. But it is an absolutely clear moment for us to compare and contrast the decisions of two leaders. And it is a simple matter of priorities. And the Prime Minister has prioritised the survival of his majority over the fair treatment of women in society. And that has not happened in the New South Wales Parliament. To give you another example, when it comes to Andrew Laming, imagine if he was employed on a 3-year contract. No, so not employed long term, a 3-year contract in a senior corporation. And that corporation says, you have engaged in some truly horrendous behaviour. We have seen the allegations of the women against Andrew Laming and the rolling allegations, it seems, including allegedly being involved in the crime of upskirting, which is a crime. And whether or not you would say, you know what, you are sacked from the end of your 3-year contract. That's it. After the end of your contract, we're not having you back again after the end of that 3 years. No, you'd be sacked immediately. Yeah. And yes, it is true the Prime Minister doesn't have the ability to sack someone from Parliament. However, we've seen the contrast of the New South Wales Deputy Premier today. He could make his position much more clear. He could stand up on behalf of women of Australia who right now are watching him very closely and are very angry, and take some action that was far more declarative. He could ask him to resign. He hasn't done that.
Avril, we're talking now about potential consequences, which is what's been kind of lacking when it comes to discussions and allegations of sexual harassment and other behaviour in the past. This is one thing that's said to drive cultural change. In all of your experience working with various organisations, including the Army and others, what is the best way to drive cultural change? Because it always seems like such a mammoth task.
I think there's a couple of things. The first is that we absolutely need people with expertise in two areas. One is in change management, because we know that 60 to 70% of change programs fail because people don't actually understand or engage with the change because it hasn't been communicated. They haven't been told the what, the why, the how, the when, etc. The second is you need experts, not just in change management, but people who understand the impact of things like sexual harassment and bullying, to not only guide people through the consequences to the perpetrators, but the impact that it has on bystanders. I describe harassment and bullying as throwing a stone in a pond, and it has this ripple effect where it doesn't just affect the alleged perpetrator and the alleged victim, it affects the teams who work for them, it affects both families who are actually innocent in all of this. So people who actually understand how you drive and explain and actually coach people on behavioural change. And the third is that it absolutely has to come from the top and the bottom, and it's got to be driven by women and men working together collaboratively. It can't just be done by women. We're already converted.
And it can't just be a committee of politicians. You're saying
Absolutely.
you need external consultants
Absolutely.
and experts. Fiona, I just want to ask you here, because we've seen a range of women from the Liberal Party come out and say things that they wouldn't ordinarily say. So many have reached a tipping point, and so many have reached a point of fury and frustration and also disgust. Are you among those ranks?
Look, I haven't had any problems with anybody when I was running as a candidate. I've had bigger problems in private industry outside than I've had in Parliament, and certainly the attacks that I had were through social media.
OK, we want to get to social media now, because when announcing his New Look cabinet yesterday, the Prime Minister made a point of highlighting social media as a source of what he calls the degrading of respect. Now, this is a refrain we've heard from across his cabinet for more than a week now. Speaking on ABC Radio National this morning, newly appointed Home Affairs Minister Karen Andrews hinted that further action might be taken against some of the social media giants.
Social media certainly has a range of problems. Is it the only problem? No, clearly not. There are a range of issues. There are some things that we need to be looking at with social media and the impact on our lives. And we should not walk away from having to take strong action if needed to deal with that. There's a level of anonymity in social media that is concerning, that people are not making comments under their own name and they can hide, and I don't think they should be allowed to hide.
Fiona, I'm really interested in your reflections on this and also what happened to you. But I guess my primary question is whether this is what the problem is now. I mean, Brittany Higgins wasn't allegedly raped on social media. She wasn't called a lying cow on social media. People didn't masturbate over desks on social media, and this sexting also did not occur on social media. The only thing we're currently discussing that occurred on social media was a federal MP, Andrew Laming, abusing some constituents. So why the focus on this now?
Well, certainly from my perspective and my experience is that through social media, a whole range of behaviours and words and actions that we would normally consider completely unacceptable, for some reason it's acceptable on social media. People will put up posts that they wouldn't normally do. They will say things that they wouldn't say to your face. And I've had people put things up on social media who've subsequently said to me, oh, it was just social media, it didn't really matter, nobody takes it seriously. And some of that is truly horrific. It's not just about sexualisation of women, but it's also the whole thing with bullying of children at school. But the sexualisation of women on social media and on our broader media is really terrible, and it takes away the perspective of what is right and what is wrong. Where are the boundaries? When people see those sorts of things on social media, somehow it normalises those behaviours, and they don't think. They should have an understanding of what is right and what is wrong, and we've certainly seen a lot of behaviour that is completely unacceptable. But once you start taking away there are rights, there are wrongs, and what those boundaries are, you lose that amongst people in society.
Jamila, can I ask you about this? Because you've spoken a lot about bullying and poor behaviour on social media, about trolling. You've experienced it as many women in the public eye have. I'm just wondering still about the timing of this, because without social media, would Chantal Contos have been able to gather the thousands and thousands of stories of rape and sexual assault in schools when she put up her petition on Instagram? We have Brittany Higgins, who is present on Twitter. There are many, many voices of survivors who have come out through different forums on social media now. Well, couldn't you possibly argue that in this climate, social media has been more of a help than a hindrance to women?
Social media is a double-edged sword. There's no question about that. And for women, it is absolutely true that we experience a degree of sexualised violent rhetoric that men do not. Absolutely. This is a question I think it is very much worthy of the Parliament's attention and the Prime Minister's attention. The question is, why now? Why at this particular moment? Because if we take the examples you gave at the start of this chat, Julia, Brittany Higgins wasn't assaulted because she was tweeting a lot. Andrew Laming didn't photograph a woman's underwear and put it on Facebook. Linda Reynolds didn't describe Brittany Higgins as a lying cow on TikTok. And Scott Morrison didn't go after Andrew Clennell at a press conference when he was on Snapchat. None of this is about social media. This is about stuff that is happening in and around and connected to our nation's parliament. So while this is a very legitimate debate and topic of discussion, it is a straw man argument right now. The Prime Minister is basically saying, look over there.
Talal.
Can I say, and allow me to raise my voice and maybe even metaphorically thump the table, sitting here amongst
Thanks for the warning.
seasoned and exceptional females. Enough is enough. A joke's a joke. It is true that social media could be horrendous. It's a good thing and a bad thing. But this has nothing to do with social media. The Prime Minister is at sea at the moment, defending the indefensible. And we as a nation require leadership. So whether Labor, Liberal, Calathumpian, whether you want to do it using conservative values, my daughters and my wife, or you want to be a progressive, it just goes down to one thing, human rights. Do you agree that everybody is equal? And if you agree that everybody is equal, same thing I said last time on the drum, a day after it happened to Porter, which is an issue which is very fraught. But what is not fraught, what is clear, is that we've got to acknowledge there's a clear problem in our parliaments, in our leadership and in our corporations, where women, especially young women, but women in general, are not treated respectfully. And not all women, just some, but that some is way too much. And everybody should acknowledge that and stop dilly-dallying around, deflecting. And this is just a sad joke to talk about social media all of a sudden. The Prime Minister got it wrong and he should fix it.
Well, someone who's not been deflecting is former Labor MP Kate Ellis. She's spoken out about the toxic culture since leaving Parliament and is asking other female colleagues to do the same. Speaking to Australian Story, she revealed, like many young staffers, she was often hit on by male colleagues. But she says she was lucky compared to others.
I saw a lot of things, but I also heard allegations of what I'd call serious sexual assault and misconduct from an elected Labor MP.
Jamila, I know you were Chief of Staff to Kate Ellis and were probably there when much of this occurred. And this is obviously recounted in her book, which is called Sex, Lies and Question Time, which is just out at the moment. Jamila, when last night we have Kate Ellis saying things like, I heard allegations of serious sexual assault from an elected Labor MP, firstly, can we be confident that that will be followed up and that there will be consequences there? And secondly, why did Anthony Albanese in his, in the ALP National Convention today not mention women? I think he used the word women once, but not mention this issue at all in his speech.
I think if I can take the first point, there is no question that there are issues of sexual assault and harassment on, I'm not going to say both sides, I'm going to say in politics, because it doesn't just happen in the major parties, it happens everywhere. It is a culture in politics that is reflective of a culture that exists within our broader society and within our workplaces. I do think, from what I have heard from colleagues and friends who are Labor Party staffers and have been working in the building more recently than I did, and even more recently than Kate did, that things have improved with the election of more women. That just having more women in senior roles, more women MPs, more women shadow ministers, that has helped. Having said that, I experienced the same things that Kate did when I worked at Parliament House, and I don't think we should kid ourselves that this is about one political party. Having said that, you can't take forward allegations unless an individual is willing to come forward and make them. And like Kate, I think it would be useful for the political debate for Labor women who feel they are ready to, and that it would be good for their own healing if they have been victims of sexual assault, to come forward. But I worry about putting an expectation on people that they have to speak about their assault publicly or in the media. Because I can understand why someone who is a survivor of sexual assault or harassment, or even on the very extreme ends of the spectrum of rape, doesn't want to talk about it publicly. So I think sort of laying that expectation out is a worry.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were. Okay. I absolutely agree with Jamila, but I just make the point. We should be talking, that definitely should happen, but we should be talking to men about doing what they're supposed to be doing and enforcing those rules as best as we can, instead of expecting, and I agree with you, having that expectation on survivors of assault to do something about it, officially complain.
So how do you think that's happening? I mean,
it's not. That's the problem. The problem is we keep talking about the victims, about what they should do, and then ask them to go through a process. And that's the issue. There's a threshold there that makes it very difficult. Why don't we spend more time making sure that not only do men understand, but don't go about doing this. Talk to men about their behaviour as opposed to what women should do once that happens.
And the men in your life talking to each other at the moment?
We don't talk about it at all, because it is not, well, certainly in my circles, it's not something that is a done thing. It's not, you wouldn't, even the people I speak to, men, women and otherwise, we don't engage in such activity. I'm not saying all men do.
But even in light of these news stories?
No, well, in the places that I have worked, there's always been gossip, always been innuendo for men and women. But out and out sexual assault, out and out criminal assault, even worse than that, there's not been. But the issue is when it happens, so nobody ever speaks to you about it. Nobody says, this is the wrong thing, you know. Making a bad joke is one thing, sort of, you know, but continuously doing it over a period of time is a very different matter altogether.
It's a cultural issue. But just quickly, Jamila, I understand what you're saying, but do you think that the leader of the Labor Party should have made some mention of this in his speech today?
I'm reluctant to comment when I haven't actually heard the speech, which shows what a terrible former Labor staffer I am. However, I'm surprised that there wasn't more of a mention of women, even for purely political reasons, from the leader of the opposition. We know that we have a coalition government who in their last budget were accused from multiple quarters of not paying enough attention to women's interests, for not putting money behind the fight for gender equality, and not putting enough funding towards the prevention of violence. So I would have thought that would have been something to lead with, something to talk about in a big way. But again, I'm reluctant to say much when I haven't actually seen the speech.
Sure. All right, I want to talk about health now, just very quickly, because I want to talk about something else.
So I just think it's really important that in this whole argument and the whole debate, what we do is we look at it as a non-partisan issue. This is a whole issue in Parliament. It's a whole issue broader across society, and we need to look at it in that way rather than think about it as a party political issue, or we will never get it resolved.
All right, now on to another matter now, because we're all wondering about Easter, about Queensland. There is still uncertainty about whether Brisbane residents will be out of lockdown by Easter, with at least 8 new locally acquired cases of COVID detected in the past 24 hours.
In terms of the Greater Brisbane region, we just have to take this day by day. I said that we will give the most up-to-date information we can every single morning, and so far the fact that we have these cases that are linked is good news. That is good news. Do we expect to see more cases? Probably. Probably we will see more. The big question will be whether or not we see unlinked community transmission. So it's a day-by-day proposition, but that is why this 3-day lockdown is absolutely necessary.
These latest clusters have been linked back to Princess Alexandra Hospital, where a doctor was infected earlier in March. Now, one of those infected is a nurse who is thought to have contracted the virus from a patient. It's been revealed she was one of a number of unvaccinated staff. But today, Queensland Health Minister took a swipe at the federal government over the slow pace of the vaccine rollout.
The amount of vaccine that we have been supplied by the Commonwealth did not all arrive on the first day. So it has progressively increased, just as our vaccinations have progressively increased. And in fact, we did 6,004 vaccinations yesterday. So that is a record number of vaccinations. And we've done 65,129 now.
The good news is that around 89% of frontline health workers in Queensland are now vaccinated, and from tomorrow only, vaccinated staff will be working with infected patients.
As of tomorrow, I will mandate, as I've been saying now for several weeks, to the hospital and health services that only people who've had their first dose of the vaccine, whether it be Pfizer or AstraZeneca, can work directly with confirmed cases of COVID. We did set ourselves that target for between 4 and 6 weeks to get all of 1A workers vaccinated. We've reached that. We believe we'll have finished that by tomorrow.
You're watching The Drum. With me on the panel, Managing Director of Crescent Wealth, Talal Yassin, Management Consultant Avril Henry, in Canberra, small business owner and Liberal Party member Fiona Cotvoys, and in Melbourne, Chief Creative Officer of Nine's Future Women, and a former Labor staffer, Jamila Rizvi. Just offshore, our closest neighbour, Papua New Guinea, is dealing with a different crisis. Over the past week, cases of coronavirus have more than doubled, with 5,205 cases and 51 deaths now recorded. These high numbers make it unlikely Scott Morrison will resume flights between PNG and Australia. The route's been closed since March 17, meaning fly-in, fly-out workers like James Barclay won't be returning home anytime soon, as the Drum's Dale Drinkwater found out.
So we're about 900 k's offshore of Port Moresby, so it's about a 2.5 hour flight from Port Moresby to here. It's a dirt runway, so it's always pretty sketchy landing here. We fly normally from Adelaide to Brisbane and Brisbane to Cairns, and then we get on a charter flight normally straight to the island, and then we'd normally do a 16 days on, 14 days off. Since COVID restrictions sort of came in, that sort of lengthened the swings. We generally do 2 weeks quarantine in Port Moresby, and then we'll fly straight to site, get a COVID test on site, and then normally stay here from anywhere from 3 to 6 months. If you tried your best to get home right now, you'd probably still be a month or a month and a half until you could actually get home. You could get to Port Moresby, but you're going to be in Port Moresby sort of indefinitely until you get a flight back. So, which could be a long time because there's a lot of people here at the moment trying to go home. We always knew this was going to come, probably sort of hit home a little bit. We sort of got the news that we are really actually stuck here. Some of the guys are talking about trying to fly to Hong Kong or Singapore to try and get back to Australia. We've been told that if we were to crack COVID, and we needed medical support, we'd have a medevac straight back to Australia. I think there's been 39 cases on the island, but they've all been symptomatic, so they've been tested as they came in. Don't see Dad get worried too much. He sort of said, "Oh, you need to come home. Don't worry about money, just come home." Mum's in tears. At the end of the day, we chose sort of to come over here, and if I was in Queensland or I lived in Cairns, I probably wouldn't like people flying back in from Port Moresby, potentially bringing COVID back to Queensland.
It was back in November last year that Justice Paul Brereton handed down his landmark report, finding that 39 Afghan men had been unlawfully killed by Australian Special Forces. At the time, the Chief of the Defence Force said that families of the victims would receive compensation quickly and without waiting for the establishment of any criminal liability. But now, nearly 4.5 months on, an advocate for 3 of the families has told The Drum that none of them have received any damages. The relatives of 3 men who were allegedly murdered by Australian troops have yet to even hear from the Australian government. This all comes as a new office that was set up to build criminal cases against the Australian soldiers involved still hasn't appointed any investigators. The Drum's Eliza Harvey has more.
When the Chief of the Defence Force revealed the extent of the alleged war crimes in Afghanistan, he had a very simple message for victims.
To the people of Afghanistan, on behalf of the Australian Defence Force, I sincerely and unreservedly apologise for any wrongdoing by Australian soldiers.
Now, months on from the release of the Brereton report, which found credible evidence to support the accusation of murder and torture against Afghan civilians, progress has been slow. An advocate for some of the affected families, Bilal Sarawi, has told The Drum that the ones I spoke to told me they haven't been approached by the Australian government. He also said they are insisting on a fair trial where they want to see the perpetrators. Human Rights Watch wants compensation to be paid as soon as possible.
Reparations is extremely important. It's not just the decent thing to do, it's actually required under international law. And I don't think we need to wait for there to be criminal convictions for compensation to be made.
Last year, it was revealed that a new government office established to build criminal cases against the Australian soldiers accused of war crimes still hasn't appointed any investigators.
These are very difficult, complicated crimes, and so hiring the right people is critically important. We're talking about crimes that committed a long time ago in a place that is logistically and security-wise very difficult to access, Afghanistan. And so we want these prosecutions to succeed. So it's very important that we hire the right people to investigate these crimes.
For more on this, we're joined in Melbourne by performance psychologist and former SAS team commander Harry Moffat. Harry, welcome to The Drum.
Hi Julia, thanks for having me.
Now, 4.5 months, no compensation, and the families have not even received a word from the Australian government. Is this good enough?
I don't think so. The information flow's been pretty poor, I'd say, across the whole ecosystem of this investigation. And but I do understand the slow hands of bureaucracy. Setting up an office of this nature comes with untold complexities, not least training people up and finding the appropriate people and getting access to some of the areas they'll need to get. So I'm not surprised, but I think it's frustrating for everyone involved. I think equally, it's been going on for over a decade now, or nearly a decade now. So for many of us in the community, it continues the frustration of moving things forward.
What kind of impact is it having on the community more broadly?
Profoundly across everyone from the former men and women who have, for the last 70, 80 years, worked hard to establish, in my case, the Special Air Service Regiment and Special Operations in Australia, through to current serving members who were likely not there at the time under the investigation or encompassed by the investigation, right through to families, partners and the children too, stories of children being jibed in schoolyards. So I say that just to highlight the breadth of the impact across our community.
Tell us what your view is about the very particular culture of the SAS. Some of its strengths can also lead to apparent, dangers as well. Tell us about the warrior culture.
Yeah, so strengths can be weaknesses, working in isolation, working for long periods of time on little sleep and high fatigue and high stress. We're trained and focused on doing that, but it does come with a downside at times. But we mitigate that really well, I think. Culture's strange. I don't see it as a good or bad, as it's too often talked about. Culture is agnostic to good or bad from my perspective. I think that culture is chock full of humans who are good, bad and everything in between, and thus behaves that way. And I think the job of someone like myself now, working in organisations and teams, is to find the good and amplify that, and the bad and dampen that. And I say that as a premise to somewhat counterintuitively, that the culture of the regiment is strong and is for the most part very good. In fact, for the entirety of my service, I have been impressed by our culture. It's a tough job. I'm sure that's not lost on anyone. But if these allegations come that have been, or the findings of the Brereton report, the allegations found to be true, then I think then we need to address those as quickly as possible. And the last thing I would say is that regardless of guilt or innocence in the investigations, the unit has been working to review its selection and policies and procedures and training all through this period. And I'm really proud of the unit's kept up a magnificent capability all through these challenging times and reacted to all of the findings.
Okay, and yet, Avril, much work needs to be done. Now, I just want to highlight for our viewers your expertise in this area, because this kind of cultural change is something that you've thought about and worked in for a long time. You've been strategic advisor to the Chief of Navy. You're also part of the Navy's People and Capability Committee, the only female and civilian, the first female and only civilian. You've been a senior advisor to the Chief of Army on gender diversity, and you've coached the generals of the SAS between 2013 and 2019 and worked with them on their culture, right?
Yes. Yeah.
What can you tell us about this particular group and what cultural change might look like and what cultural change is necessary?
Okay. Firstly, I'd like to say to Harry, I totally agree with him that some of the finest people I have met in my time working across all three services have been people in special forces. And I actually worked really closely with them for a period of 3 years, where I not only was advising and coaching the last two generals, and the most recent one has just gone out of that role about 3 months ago, but the top two layers of their leadership. So what they call their commissioned officers, so their lieutenant colonels, their colonels and their brigadiers, and taking into account what's called the non-commissioned officers, who are the people who lead the troops on the ground. And I think that while there is a strong culture of mateship, what we've had with this situation is a small group, and I think that's really important for people to understand, so that the whole of Special Forces don't get tarred with the same brush. And at present we know the allegations are against about 25 or 30 people. But in the time frame that these incidents happened right through till 2019, there have been between 600 and 800 Special Forces soldiers and non-commissioned officers and commissioned officers at any point in time. So the percentage is actually quite small. It's about 3%. Now that doesn't negate the atrocities and the horrendous nature of the behaviour, but within that cohort I think there has been, and when I say cohort I mean the people who perpetrated those behaviours, there was a code of silence that said in order to be accepted and part of this group you don't speak up. And I think the biggest challenge to cultural change is for people to actually acknowledge what they knew and when they knew it, because I truly don't believe that people did not know for 10 years. There would have been enough rumours and enough rumblings that people were aware of it. And I know as early back as 5 years ago, the general I was working with, who I have immense regard for, who is no longer in defence, you know, was raising issues and saying perhaps we need to have a long, hard look at some of the underlying cultural challenges of small groups. Because those small groups, in my view, have their own inherent cultures within the overall culture.
Also loyalty, those kind of codes, and you have each other's back.
And it's a loyalty
even when
to
it's
people. It's not always a loyalty to Special Forces or a loyalty to the Army or a loyalty to Defence. It's a loyalty to small groups of people.
Yeah.
Harry, do you want to respond to what Avril's saying there about really bystanders needing to be able to say what they saw and what they knew in order for kind of broader responsibility to be taken?
Yeah, the unit's not a place where people bystand and aren't willing to give you their opinions. I can promise you that. It's a radical honesty environment and needs to be necessarily so. What I would say is it's not. I don't think it's fair. Although I agree, but I don't think it's fair to say that people are saying they didn't know and all of a sudden they're surprised. We've known about this for a long time. I think it's worth reminding everyone that these matters were raised within the unit. I think that's
yes,
on the record,
absolutely.
and right back in the day now. It's almost a decade. And we all found out through different means, and I think this is a matter for public record or open source, some through rumours in the unit, so that's met with disbelief. I mean, that was the first time I heard of it. No, this couldn't be true. This is not us. Lots of people through the media, they were first raised back, I think, in one of Chris Masters' books and Nick McKenzie reports. So I think we've known about it for a long, long time. It's fatiguing and it's been like a slow burn for all of us. And this is part of the issue at this end of it all. There's some very fatigued and stressed and some people that are really hurting.
Yeah, just quickly, Avril, yes.
I just want to add one point. Harry makes some very good points there about people have known about it for a long time. One of my observations working in defence was that they rotate people through jobs every 2 to 3 years. And you don't see that in a corporate. Like a CEO, even today, CEOs on average have 5 years tenure, whereas 10, 15 years ago, a CEO would have been there 20 years or a managing partner at somewhere like PW. But what they do is they move them every 2 to 3 years. And I think that's a huge challenge, that no one stays long enough to actually do something about it.
Definitely, and in particular in special operations where we need to keep the knowledge, that tacit knowledge transfer as uninterrupted as possible, and it is a huge challenge. The special operations have been working inside a conventional construct here in Australia for a while, and it's not the problem. It's just something I think is part of the solution potentially once the allegations have been heard properly.
Yeah. And just quickly here, Fiona, because I've got something else I want to get to before the end of the show. Just with your two hats, you've been in the Army Reserve, you've also worked as a Lifeline counsellor, and we have Harry here talking about fatigue and exhaustion. And is it not the case that if this has been known about for a long time and the investigation's now dragging on and kind of seems to be working at this glacial pace, that there are significant issues for not just for reparations, for compensation for those who were hurt, which is obviously should be the families of those who were hurt, but which should be the priority, but for also the entire kind of community that is dealing with this?
Look, it's something I think everybody wants to see dealt with as quickly as possible, but at the same time it's really important that we have the right people doing those investigations, because otherwise the investigations of those who should be found guilty will just fall over, or it'll be extended for a longer period of time, and the people who are currently being sort of underneath the shadow of it, they need to be cleared as well. But I really would like to see the people who should have reparations paid, that occurring as quickly as possible.
Now, Harry, stay with us because I want to get your thoughts on this as well. It's a New South Wales inquiry into coercive control that's heard that up to 85% of domestic violence victims have also been subjected to economic abuse by their partners. The inquiry is looking at new laws criminalising specific behaviours that abusive partners use to control their loved ones.
Often an abuser has restricted their partner's access to a phone, to money and to transport. So that is not just emotional abuse, it's also economic abuse. The abuser may be harassing the victim at work, even causing the victim to resign just to save her workmates from the worst of it. That's not just harassment or stalking, that's also economic abuse. An abuser may physically harm or threaten a victim unless they pay all the bills or take out a loan they don't want.
And it seems that finances are a pressure point in many relationships. There's a new study out. Take this. Researchers at the Australian National University have found that when a man earns less than his female partner, he's 35% more likely to abuse her. Dr. Susan Heward-Bell is a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney and a leader in domestic and family violence research. She talked us through these findings.
The findings really supported that the strong link that's emerging between patriarchal social systems and structures and violence and domestic abuse that's perpetrated against women. It also confirms, I think, that body of evidence that shows that domestic violence isn't confined to a particular strata of society. It really highlights that domestic violence can manifest in various forms. To me, it really highlighted the crucial need for policies and leadership on these issues that really focuses on trying to address sexist norms. You know, when we get into conversations about, you know, women should be like this and men should be like that, we really need to be you know, having a much more sort of nuanced conversation. I guess one of the things about the findings of this research, though, that I think is important to think about from a policy perspective is that it would be a real mistake to use these findings to justify inaction on addressing economic inequality.
Jamila, how do you interpret this research? I mean, what it says in particular about the breadwinner kind of connection to masculinity. Blokes have often said this is a burden. Here's evidence that it can also be a danger.
I think there'd be a lot of Australians who are hearing this report today through this morning when it was reported initially in the papers and then now, and being a little bit surprised. I think for a long time we've been fed this idea that as women are able to claim more of a economic role in society and move up in leadership of organisations and are paid better as we close that gender pay gap, and as we work to women being more fairly represented, I suppose, in the executive or senior ranks of organisations, that this would be a key factor in achieving gender equality more generally. And I think what we've been shown today is that while we are working on increasing gender equality, we also need to be ready for the backlash, because when you have experienced a level of privilege your whole life, and in our society, most men experience some degree of privilege, and that is your norm. That is your version of equality. And so when that starts to be taken away, in even the smallest of ways, even if it's a perception rather than a reality, that feels unfair to you. And there are some people who are going to respond inappropriately, and there are some people who are going to respond criminally. So I think we need to be talking in government policy terms about not only how we have that conversation about the broad connections and causes of violence, the root cause of violence and the problems of gender inequality, but we also need a strategy on how we're going to deal with the backlash, because as we've seen, the victims are going to be women yet again.
And Talal, it was interesting, the results. It didn't differ across age, across income, country of birth. It was the same finding across all the groups, is that when a woman started to out-earn her partner, she was substantially more likely to be abused.
I think ANU did the research, the fine university, which I belong, and I believe the findings. I am a bit surprised. I truly believe the findings. And because I think misogyny, domestic violence, sexual violence, doesn't really matter whether you're wealthy or poor. Misbehaviour is misbehaviour. But I want to add one other element that probably has not been related to this finding, which shows the more a woman earns compared to a man, which creates envy and inferiority complex and all the rest of it. We're just guessing at that. The one other factor not mentioned anywhere, but is clearly study after study after study has shown increases domestic violence, is alcohol. Sure. When those issues come, ask any police officer, what are the main call-outs you get? Well, we get domestic violence. Whether it's Mossman, Hunters Hill, Mount Druitt, you name a suburb in Sydney, Melbourne, Altona, Elsternwick, I mean, I'll go around the country. Every copper will tell you domestic violence, so males assaulting females who they have an intimate relationship with, and alcohol was usually involved. So that don't surprise me, but what I'm surprised is that people are surprised.
Harry, how do you interpret this?
Well, it's a very complex area. There's no doubt about that. It goes to individual differences in perpetrators. It goes to role modelling and upbringing, socioeconomic factors. It's just so complicated. What I will say is it makes me sick in the guts when I hear of yet another woman being murdered by their partners. I feel a little bit of shame as a man and as a privileged man. There's no doubt about that. It's taken me a long time to see that. as an organisational psychologist too, I should say, I'm not clinical or performance. I've been lucky enough to be exposed to a couple of organisations here in Melbourne where the CEOs and the leadership have stood up in front of their companies and basically said we won't stand for it anymore, and put policies and processes in place. And I think strong leadership from men, equally with women, alongside women, is going to be needed more than ever. And the other part here, we're in a bit of a paradigm shift, a kind of a liminal space, if you will, between, I guess, last century and this century. If we zoom out a bit and noting that, issues like domestic violence are grave and we must treat them. But if we zoom out a bit, there's a whole lot of change going on at the moment, and some men are feeling disempowered, I sense. That's part of it, already been hit on by a couple of the other panellists. And there's going to be, as counterintuitive as this might sound, I think, a little bit of tolerance needed, a bit of time and patience, education. There's some great groups around our community at the moment with young men in football clubs and schools, and passing on new norms. And up to guys like me to elbow your mate in the ribs and say, hey, that's not good enough anymore, especially in front of other people. I think we all have to account up and down the chain.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Jamila, I just want to bring you in on this one. Do you think we need to have patience for guys who are still kind of struggling to deal with women's equality?
I think women are pretty impatient. I think if you had a look at the rallies just last week, there were 100,000 women on the streets saying they're sick of being patient. I think we've been patient for a long time. And certainly when we are talking about one woman at least a week who is killed by her intimate partner, I don't have any patience for that anymore. I recognise that...
I'm not saying patience for violent acts of violence. I'm sorry if that's how it came across. That wasn't what I meant at all. I just thought it was a slow... There's some things to play out, so I apologise if it come across that way.
So you mean being patient in having conversations in which people need to not be afraid of saying the wrong thing? Is that what you mean? Like patient in educating people and causing change?
Sorry to kind of ambush, but patience in the next generation of men coming through. The partner of my daughter is a completely different man to what I might have been when I was growing up. So I meant it in that context. Certainly, I have no patience for change in terms of violence or anything like that. I got it. Avril, how do you see this? And it's interesting because a lot of people are really surprised by this, but I've seen this dynamic play out in the relationships of people I know so much.
Yes.
When a woman starts to out-earn or is more professionally more successful, that can create a weird kind of tension.
I think it's cultural and generational as well. My first marriage, which was throughout the 80s through to the early to mid-90s, I was married to somebody of Indian extraction, and throughout our marriage I earned more, and there were periods when I was the breadwinner when he went and studied. And it was always a cause of tension between us. And while I might not have experienced physical domestic violence, I certainly had my family thinking I should have married a doctor or a lawyer. I'm glad I didn't.
Right.
And we had his side of the family wondering why an educated woman who was white would marry a black man who was from a different profession. And so that tension actually throughout the 13 years we were married never actually ever went away. And, we talk about having patience, and I understand at an intellectual level, but, like many women, at an emotional level, I go, enough's enough. Women have been outperforming men in terms of academic performance, and graduates from TAFEs and universities in Year 12 since 2009. And pay equity, we've had 4 pay equity cases in 40 years, and we still don't have pay equity. And so I think, the time for discussion requires that men should listen, because we also know that 76% of men don't listen very well.
Oh, except to our show. All right, let's end on that note. Listen, if you've been affected by anything we've been discussing at all tonight in tonight's show, call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800 737 732. And that's it for tonight. I want to thank our panel, Talal Yassin, Avril Henry, Fiona Kotvoss and Jamila Wisby. And to our guest, Harry Moffat. I hope you have a great evening. I'm going to see you tomorrow night again. See you then. Good night.